Find out about the Night of Sorrows, the night the conquistadors fled Tenochtitlan in panic, losing a fortune in Aztec gold to the waters of the lake. The rain in Tenochtitlan did not fall, it hammered. It was a relentless, rhythmic assault against the stone skin of the world, a liquid curtain that turned the causeways into slick, treacherous throats ready to swallow the unwary. Inside the Palace of Axayacatl, the air was not merely humid, it was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the chest, thick with the scent of burning pine, damp wool, and the metallic tang of fear. The year was 1520, and the heart of the Aztec Empire beat with a terrifyingly slow, irregular rhythm. To the casual observer, the city was at peace, the Great Lake reflecting the gray sky like a polished mirror of obsidian. But inside the gilded cage of the palace, the illusion of tranquility had long since shattered, replaced by a suffocating tension that tightened with every passing hour. The Spanish, the self-proclaimed lords of this new world, were masters only in name. They walked the halls with the swagger of conquerors, their boots ringing loud on the polished floors, but their eyes betrayed them. Their eyes darted to the shadows, to the dark corners where the torchlight failed to reach, scanning for the knife in the dark, the silent arrow, the uprising that every soldier knew in his gut was coming. They were jailers, yes, holding the divine emperor Moctezuma in his own walls, but they were also prisoners, trapped in a city that floated on water and hatred.
The palace had become a foundry of desecration. In the great central courtyard, sheltered from the torrential downpour by makeshift awnings of woven reeds and stolen cotton mantles, the fires roared. It was a scene torn from the deepest pits of an inferno, painted in the stark, violent strokes of a nightmare. Here, the cultural soul of a civilization was being fed into the maw of avarice. The conquistadors, stripped to their waists, their skin glistening with sweat and soot, worked with a feverish intensity that bordered on madness. They were not creating, they were unmaking. Before them lay a hoard that defied comprehension, a mountain of gold that shimmered with a spiritual light, the treasure of Moctezuma. There were discs of hammered gold as wide as cartwheels, representing the sun and the moon, etched with the complex cosmology of a people who tracked the stars with distinct precision. There were necklaces of heavy, hollow beads shaped like scorpions and jaguars, greaves embossed with the faces of gods, and delicate hummingbirds cast with such skill that the metal seemed to possess the lightness of feathers. And into the crucibles it all went.
The soldiers, men like Rodrigo de Triana, a brute of a man with a scar dividing his beard into two jagged halves, wielded heavy hammers. With grunts of exertion, they brought the iron down upon the delicate artistry of the Aztec master smiths. A mask of Xipe Totec, the flayed lord, crafted from a single sheet of gold, crumpled under the blow, its hollow eyes collapsing inward, its frozen screams silenced forever. Rodrigo didn't see the god. He didn't see the centuries of tradition or the sacred hands that had shaped the metal. He saw only the weight. He saw Maravides. He saw a vineyard in Andalusia, a title, a whore with silk sheets. He saw his future in the destruction of the past. "Feed it," he growled, tossing the crumpled mask into the clay pot sitting atop the charcoal fire. The flames licked up, hungry and orange, reflecting in the wild eyes of the men gathered around. The heat was intense, singing the hair on their arms, baking the moisture from their skin until they looked like dried leather. The smell was unique, not just the sulfur of the fire, but the sweet, cloying scent of melting beeswax used in the casting process, mixed with the sharp ozone of superheated metal. It was the smell of greed.
As the gold liquefied, losing its form, its history, and its soul, it became something duller,
something heavy and dead. They poured it into crude molds, turning gods into ingots, art into currency. The famous tejo de oro, the gold bars, piled up like bricks, a wall of yellow wealth that offered no protection against the hostility gathering outside the palace walls. Watching this industrial slaughter from the shadows of the colonnade was Captain Hernán Cortés. He stood still, a statue of rusted steel and black velvet. His helmet was tucked under his arm, revealing a hairline that was receding, a brow furrowed with the weight of a gamble that had grown too large to control. He was the architect of this audacity, the man who had burned his ships to ensure there was no retreat, only victory or death. Standing there, illuminated by the flickering chiaroscuro of the foundry fires, he looked less like a hero of Christendom and more like a man standing on the precipice of the abyss, waiting for the wind to shift. He watched his men, seeing the lust on their faces, the way their hands trembled not from fatigue, but from the proximity to such immense wealth. He knew that gold was a poison as much as a prize. It made men reckless, it made them slow, and they needed to be fast.
"They are melting their own souls, Captain," a voice murmured beside him. Cortés did not turn. He knew the voice. It was Father Olmedo, the friar who walked the fine line between saving souls and blessing slaughter. "They are melting metal, Father," Cortés replied, his voice a rasp of dry leaves. "Metal that will pay for the ships we build, the powder we need, and the king's fifth. God understands the necessity of logistics." "Does he?" Olmedo stepped into the light, his face gaunt, his cassock stained with the mud of the causeway. "And what of him, the emperor? You break his gods in his own courtyard. How long do you think a living deity endures humiliation before he remembers he is a god?" Cortés finally turned, his eyes hard and cold, reflecting the firelight like polished flint. "Moctezuma is no god. He is a man, and a broken one at that. He sits in his chambers and weeps for omens while we strip the walls. He is useful, Father, but do not mistake his passivity for patience. He is paralyzed by his own superstition."
Superstition is a powerful force, Hernán. It is what brought us here. It is what keeps them from swarming the walls. But the drums. Have you heard the drums tonight?
Cortés listened. Above the hiss of the rain and the clang of hammers, there was a sound, low, rhythmic, vibrating through the soles of their boots. The teponastli, the war drums of the district wards. They were not loud, not yet. They were a heartbeat, steady and ominous. "I hear them," Cortés said, turning back to the fire. "Let them drum. As long as we hold the head, the body cannot bite." He gestured toward the grand staircase. "I must attend to our host. Ensure the men do not pocket more than their share, Father. Greed is a sin, but theft from the crown is treason." Cortés moved away, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the wet stones, merging with the darkness that swallowed the upper levels of the palace.
Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the complex, away from the heat of the foundry, but not the heat of shame, sat Moctezuma Xocoyotzin. The room was opulent, hung with tapestries of woven feathers that shimmered with iridescence, emerald green from the quetzal, scarlet from the macaw, deep blue from the cotinga. Censers burned copal incense, the white smoke curling in the air like spirits of the ancestors, but the fragrance could not mask the stench of confinement. Moctezuma sat on a low wooden stool, not the high reed throne of his judgment hall. He wore a simple mantle of white cotton, unadorned. His headdress, the copili, lay on a mat beside him, a symbol of power he no longer had the strength to bear.
He was a man hollowed out. For months he had played the game, welcoming these strangers as ambassadors of Quetzalcoatl, then as guests, and finally submitting to them as jailers, all in a desperate attempt to decipher the will of the gods. Was this the end of the fifth sun? Was this the apocalypse foretold in the codices? He looked at his hands, copper-skinned and trembling. He was the Tlatorni, the speaker, the one who commanded the armies of the Triple Alliance, who could summon 100,000 warriors with a word, yet he sat here, silent. The door opened. It was not a stealthy entrance. The Spanish did not know how to move silently. They clanked. Cortés entered, followed by his shadow, the woman Malintzin, La Malinche. She was the bridge, the tongue, the betrayer and the savior, her eyes always cast down, but seeing everything. Cortés bowed, a gesture of courtly, exaggerated politeness that mocked the reality of their positions. Great Montezuma, Cortés said, the Spanish corruption of the name slicing through the air. I trust you are comfortable. The storm is fierce tonight. Malintzin translated, her voice soft, melodic, stripping the harsh edge from the Castilian tongue and wrapping it in the floral deference of Nahuatl. Moctezuma did not look up. He stared at the sandals on Cortés's feet, leather crusted with mud and the gold dust of his ancestors. The storm is not outside, Malinche, Moctezuma said softly to the woman, ignoring the Spaniard. Tell him the storm is here. Tell him I hear the stone weeping. Malintzin hesitated, then turned to Cortés. The Lord Emperor says the atmosphere is heavy. He is concerned for the peace of the city.
Cortés walked further into the room, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. He looked around the chamber, his eyes appraising the remaining ornaments. Tell him, Cortés said, his voice dropping an octave, that the peace of the city depends entirely on him. Tell him that as long as his people remain calm, he remains safe. But I hear whispers, Montezuma. I hear that your nephew, Cacamatzin, stirs up trouble in Texcoco. I hear that the priests are demanding blood. Cortés stepped closer, invading the personal space that no Aztec commoner would dare violate. He towered over the seated emperor. Tell him that if the drums get louder, it will not be my heart that is cut out. When Malintzin translated this, the threat wrapped in the velvet of diplomacy, Moctezuma finally looked up. His eyes were dark pools of infinite sorrow, rimmed with the red of sleepless nights. There was no anger there, only a devastating resignation. He saw Cortés not as a man, but as a force of nature, a hurricane sent by the gods to scour the land.
The gods are hungry, Moctezuma whispered. You melt their images, but you cannot melt their hunger. You eat the gold, but the gold will eat you. I cannot stop what is coming, Captain. I am but a leaf in the river. Cortés stared at him for a long moment, trying to read the enigma of this king who surrendered an empire without drawing a sword. He saw no deception, only a terrifying fatalism. It unnerved him more than a threat would have, a threat he could fight with steel. Fatalism was a fog he could not cut. Rest, Montezuma, Cortés said abruptly, turning on his heel. We will ensure your safety. He stormed out, the air in the room swirling in his wake. Outside, back in the courtyard, the rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the tension had ratcheted up. In the shadows of a henny stone pillar, a soldier named Diego huddled, his back to his comrades. Diego was young, barely 20, with a face marred by the pox and eyes that shifted like a trapped rat. He fumbled with his codpiece, his hands shaking.
Inside the rough fabric of his breeches,
cold and hard against his skin was a lump. It was a small idol, no larger than his thumb, made of solid gold. It was a figure of a goddess, Tlazolteotl, the eater of filth. He had palmed it when the overseer was distracted by a collapsing mold. It was a capital offense. Cortés had ordered all gold to be pooled, melted, and divided fairly, which meant the crown took a fifth, Cortés took a fifth, the captains took their shares, and the common soldiers were left with scraps. Diego would not settle for scraps. This little idol was his ticket home. It was a farm in Extremadura. It was freedom. He glanced around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He saw Rodrigo across the yard, wiping soot from his brow. He saw the sentries on the roof. He felt the weight of the gold against his groin, a heavy, sinful secret. He pulled it out for a split second, shielding it with his body, just to look at it one last time before hiding it deeper. The firelight caught the golden face of the goddess. She seemed to smile at him, a cruel, knowing smile. Her eyes were hollow, but in the flickering light, they seemed to fill with blood. Diego blinked, and the illusion vanished, but the dread remained. He shoved the idol back into his clothes, sweating despite the chill. He felt a sudden, irrational conviction that the idol was burning him, branding him. Greed, the friar had said. But was it greed to want to survive? Was it greed to want something for the blood he had spilled, the terror he had endured? He looked up at the black sky, at the alien stars. He felt small. He felt watched, not by Cortés, but by something ancient and hungry that lived in the stones of this city.
Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, the city of Tenochtitlan did not sleep. In the district of Tlatelolco, in the shadow of the great market, the people gathered. They were not the cowed masses the Spanish imagined. They were the people of the hummingbird of the left, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun. They had watched the strangers enter their city with curiosity, then with unease, and now with a simmering righteous fury. They had seen the Tlatoani humiliated. They had seen the sacred images of their gods melted down into featureless slugs of metal. To the Aztecs, gold was Teocuitlatl, the excrement of the gods. It was sacred because of its solar brilliance, not its purchasing power. To see it treated with such profane disregard was a tear in the fabric of the universe. In the darkness, warriors sharpened their obsidian blades, macohuitl, until the volcanic glass edges were sharper than any Spanish razor. They checked the tension of their bowstrings. They donned their cotton armor, soaked in brine to turn it hard as board. They did not speak much. The time for words had passed with the melting of the first idol.
The marketplace, usually a cacophony of commerce, was silent, save for the whisper of feet and the soft clinking of shell ornaments. A young eagle warrior, his face painted in bands of yellow and black, looked toward the Palace of Axayacatl. He could see the glow of the Spanish fires reflecting off the low clouds. He could smell the smoke. "They cook their doom," he murmured to his companion. "They eat the sun, and they think they will not burn." His companion, an older veteran with a scarred lip, nodded. "Let them melt the gold. It will be heavy to carry when they try to run. And they will run. The lake waits. The lake is hungry." The drumbeat began again, slightly louder this time. Thump, 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 thump. It resonated through the causeways, vibrating across the water. Inside the palace, Diego heard it and clutched his stolen idol. Cortés heard it and tightened his grip on his sword. Moctezuma heard it and closed his eyes, praying for an end that would be swift. The gilded cage was locked, but the key had been thrown into the dark waters, and the storm was finally breaking.
The air in Tenochtitlan had changed. It was no longer the crisp, thin air of the high valley that had greeted them months ago, filled with the scents of copal and roasting maize. Now the atmosphere hung heavy and oppressive, a tangible shroud of humidity and impending violence that clung to the skin like a fever sweat. Hernán Cortés was gone. The man whose silver tongue and iron will had held the precarious peace together had marched towards the coast, taking the best of the horses and the most seasoned veterans to confront Narvaez. Behind him, he left a void, a vacuum of power that was rapidly filling with dread. In the Palace of Axayacatl, the remaining garrison prowled the halls like caged wolves. The silence was not peaceful, it was predatory. At the center of this tightening coil stood Pedro de Alvarado. With his golden hair and beard, the Aztecs called him Tonatiuh, the sun. But he was not a sun that nurtured, he was a sun that scorched, a blinding, searing heat that promised drought and fire. Without the tempering hand of Cortés, Alvarado's paranoia began to bloom like a poisonous orchid in the jungle. Every glance from a servant, every distant drumbeat from the Tlatelolco market, every whisper in the shadows of the causeways was interpreted as a prelude to betrayal. The city, vast and labyrinthine, seemed to be breathing around them, a sleeping leviathan waiting to swallow the intruders whole. The days dragged on, marked only by the shifting angles of the shadows across the stone floors and the incessant, maddening rhythm of the city's life outside the palace walls. Alvarado slept in his armor, his hand never straying far from the hilt of his sword. He saw conspiracy in the flight of birds and treason in the offerings of flowers. His lieutenants, men hardened by war but lacking the subtle diplomatic instincts of their absent commander, fed his fears. They spoke of rumors, whispers of an uprising, of bridges being raised, of weapons being stockpiled in the temples. Whether these rumors were true or merely the phantoms of guilty consciences mattered little to Alvarado. They were gospel.
The tension reached its breaking point with the approach of Tenochtitlan. It was the holiest of months, the time to honor Tezcatlipoca and Huitzilopochtli, the gods of providence and war. A delegation of Aztec nobles, their cloaks woven with the finest cotton and their speech dripping with the deferential metaphors of the Nahuatl court, approached Alvarado. They requested permission to celebrate the festival in the courtyard of the Great Temple, as was their custom since the time of their ancestors. They promised it would be a peaceful observance, a dance of devotion, unarmed and sacred. Alvarado looked at them, his blue eyes narrowing. He saw not priests and princes, but generals and warriors. He saw the flower of the Aztec nobility, the very men who commanded the legions that could crush his small force in a heartbeat. In his fevered mind, the request was a ruse, a way to amass their forces within striking distance of the Spanish quarters. Yet to refuse might trigger the very rebellion he feared. He granted permission, but his consent was a trap, not a kindness. As the nobles bowed and retreated, Alvarado turned to his men, a grim smile twisting his bearded face. "Let them gather," he whispered, the words grating like stone on steel. "Let them bring their best. We shall see what gods they pray to when the steel bites." The plan was hatched in the dark hours of the night, a scheme born of terror and ruthlessness. They would strike first. They would decapitate the empire in a single bloody stroke. There would be no battle, only a slaughter. The Spanish soldiers honed their blades, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of tallow candles, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. They prayed to their own god for victory, oblivious to the irony of their murderous intent. Outside, the city slept, unaware that the dawn would bring not light, but a river of blood. The day of the festival dawned with a sky the color of bruised iron. The courtyard of the Great Temple, a vast expanse of paved stone surrounded by the serpentine wall of the Coatantli, began to fill. It was a kaleidoscope of motion and sound, a spectacle of such raw, vibrant beauty that it should have humbled any observer. Hundreds of the highest-ranking nobles, the elite of the Triple Alliance, gathered for the serpent dance. They were unarmed. Their weapons, the obsidian-edged maquahuitl and the piercing atlatl, had been left behind, for this was a holy communion, not a war council. They were dressed in their finest regalia,
headdresses of shimmering quetzal plumes that danced in the wind like green fire, capes of jaguar skin, armbands of gold and turquoise, and pectorals of jade that gleamed against their bronze skin. Their bodies were painted with sacred symbols, ochre and black, marking them as servants of the divine. The sheer wealth on display was staggering, a blinding array of gold and gems that caught the dull light of the morning and threw it back with defiance. The sound began as a low thrum, the heartbeat of the earth itself. The huehuetl drums, great cylinders of carved wood covered in jaguar hide, began to pound. The rhythm was hypnotic, complex and driving. Wooden flutes woven with clay whistles added a piercing, mournful melody that soared above the percussion. The nobles began to dance. It was not the chaotic movement of a mob, but a synchronized, fluid motion, a river of color flowing in circles around the stone idols. They sang as they danced, their voices rising in a choral chant that echoed off the pyramids, praising the smoking mirror and the hummingbird of the left.
They were lost in the trance of the ritual, their eyes fixed on the heavens, their spirits soaring toward the celestial plains. They saw the Spanish soldiers gathering at the entrances to the courtyard, guarding the gates, but they paid them no mind. To the dancers, the strangers were merely spectators to the grandeur of the Mexica gods. They did not see the tightened knuckles on the spear shafts, nor the cold, predatory calculation in the eyes of the men watching them. Alvarado watched from the periphery, his hand sweating against the pommel of his sword. The noise was deafening, a cacophony that grated on his nerves. To him, the drumming sounded like the beat of war, the chanting like a call for blood. He looked at the gold, the sheer, staggering amount of gold adorning the dancers. It was enough to buy kingdoms in Spain, enough to silence any critic, enough to pave his way to hell or glory. But it was the fear that drove him now, the primal instinct to kill before being killed. He exchanged glances with his captains. The signal had been agreed upon. The gates were secured. The trap was sealed. There was no way out for the dancers and no way in for the city outside. The courtyard had become a kill jar. "Now!" Alvarado roared, his voice cracking with the strain. "Santiago, and at them! Kill them all!" The command cut through the humid air like a thunderclap, freezing a moment in time before the world shattered.
The transformation was instantaneous and horrific. The spell of the music was shattered by the harsh, metallic rasp of swords being drawn. The Spanish infantry, armored in steel that deflected the weak blows of desperate hands, surged forward in a disciplined phalanx. The first rank of dancers, lost in their reverie, never saw the blow coming. Spanish steel, sharpened to a razor's edge, met unprotected flesh. Arms severed, heads lopped from shoulders, chests opened to the air. The violence was absolute and mechanical. The music faltered, then died, replaced by a collective gasp that turned into a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. The rhythm of the drums was replaced by the wet thud of bodies hitting the stone and the sickening crunch of bone. Panic erupted. The nobles, the pride of Tenochtitlan, scrambled like trapped birds. They ran towards the exits, only to find them blocked by rows of pikemen who skewered them without mercy. Some tried to scale the serpent wall, their fingers scrabbling against the stone, only to be dragged down and butchered. The courtyard, moments ago a vibrant tapestry of culture and piety, became a slaughterhouse. The blood did not just spill, it sprayed, painting the gray stones in slick crimson swathes. It pooled in the depressions of the pavement, mixing with the trampled feathers and the scattered jewels. The air grew thick with the copper scent of gore and the emptied bowels of the dying. Alvarado was in the thick of it, a demon of steel, hacking and slashing with a frenzy that bordered on madness. He struck down unarmed men, old and young alike.
He saw a drummer continuing to beat his rhythm in a trance of denial. Alvarado severed the man's hands, then his head, silencing the drum forever. It was not a battle. A battle implies two sides fighting. This was an extermination. The Spanish moved through the crowd, their swords rising and falling with the rhythmic efficiency of threshers harvesting wheat. The vibrant colors of the Aztec regalia were sullied, matted down by mud and blood. Gold pectorals were ripped from dying chests. Jade masks were shattered under iron boots. The screams of the dying were so loud they seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the temples, a chorus of agony that rose to the uncaring sky. Within an hour, it was over. The movement ceased. The only sounds remaining were the ragged breathing of the exhausted Spaniards, the groans of the maimed, and the soft patter of rain that had begun to fall, as if the heavens were trying to wash away the sin. The courtyard was carpeted in bodies, a grotesque mosaic of limbs and feathers. But silence did not bring peace. The massacre could not be contained within the walls of the temple. The screams had been heard. The few who had managed to scale the walls and escape fled into the city, their bodies covered in the blood of their kin, their voices shrieking the news. "They have murdered the lords! The strangers have killed the lords!" The cry went up from the rooftops, echoed in the marketplaces, and raced down the causeways. The initial shock of the populace, the sheer disbelief that such a sacrilege could occur, lasted only a heartbeat. Then it fractured into a volcanic rage. The tenuous spell of Spanish invincibility, the superstitious dread that had kept the city docile, was broken forever. These were not gods. Gods did not butcher unarmed worshippers. These were monsters, beasts. The reaction was swift and terrible. The great shell trumpets of the Aztec priesthood sounded from the summits of the pyramids, a mournful, angry wail that called the city to war. From the barrios and the calpulis, the warriors poured forth. They came not with the ceremonial pomp of the festival, but with the grim determination of avengers. They brought the heavy wooden macuayitos embedded with obsidian glass, the long lances, and the slings that could crack a Spanish helmet like an eggshell. The city transformed. Every canal became a moat, every rooftop a fortress, every window a murder hole. The Spanish, busy looting the bodies in the courtyard, suddenly found the air filled with a hail of stones and javelins. The sky darkened as a cloud of arrows descended upon them, driving them back into the palace. Alvarado, shaking the blood from his sword, realized his miscalculation. He had hoped to cut off the head of the snake, but he had only kicked a hornet's nest. The siege began immediately. The Aztecs cut the causeways, severing the supply of food and water. They burned the brigantines, the ships the Spanish had built to control the lake. They threw themselves against the palace walls with a ferocity that stunned the defenders.
There was no fear in them now, only a cold, consuming hatred. They did not care if they died by the hundreds, so long as they took one Spaniard with them. The palace, once a seat of power, became a prison. The Spanish were trapped in the heart of a city that wanted to digest them. Days turned into weeks of desperate defense, hunger gnawing at their bellies as fear gnawed at their souls. Weeks later, when Hernán Cortés returned, he found a nightmare. He had defeated Narvaez and returned with reinforcements, expanding his army, but as he marched down the causeway into Tenochtitlan, a chill settled into his bones. The city was silent, eerily, terrifically silent. No canoes plied the waters, no smoke rose from the hearths, the markets were empty, the people watched from behind walls and from rooftops, their eyes burning with a silent, malevolent intelligence. It was the silence of a predator waiting to spring. Cortés rode into the palace, his horse's hooves clattering loudly on the stones. He found Alvarado gaunt, his eyes rimmed with red, his armor stained and battered. The fortress was reeking of fear and excrement. What have you done? Cortés demanded, his voice echoing in the gloomy hall. He looked at the faces of his men, hollow, haunted, desperate. He looked out at the silent city, sensing the millions of eyes watching, waiting.
He realized then that the game had changed. The diplomacy, the manipulation, the careful balancing act, it was all ash. Alvarado's madness had ignited a fire that could not be extinguished with words. The conquest had ceased to be a political maneuver. It had become a fight for survival. The massacre at the temple had sown the dragon's teeth, and now the Spanish were surrounded by a harvest of warriors. They were no longer masters of the New World. They were meat in the maw of the Aztec god of war, and the jaws were beginning to close.
The world had contracted to the width of a spear throw. Where once the Spaniards had walked the causeways of Tenochtitlan like gods made of iron and solar fire, they were now rats trapped in a flooding cellar. The Palace of Axayacatl, their fortress and their prison, groaned under the assault. It was not a battle, it was a deluge. The sky above the great courtyard was no longer blue, nor was it the star-strewn black of the tropical night. It was a ceiling of hissing wood and stone, a perpetual twilight formed by the sheer density of arrows, javelins, and stones hurled by the multitude outside. The roar was the first thing that broke men. It was not the shout of an army, but the scream of a civilization. The huehuetl drums, beaten with the frantic rhythm of a heart in cardiac arrest, did not cease. They pounded against the stucco walls, vibrating through the stone floors, rattling the teeth of the starving men huddled inside. Day and night had lost their meaning. There was only the time of fighting and the time of bleeding. Hernán Cortés stood in the main hall, his face a mask of grime and dried blood, the suit of black powder ingrained in the creases of his eyes. He looked less like the captain general of a divine mission and more like a cornered wolf, his fur matted, his fangs bared in a snarl that was half courage, half terror. The air within the palace was a solid thing, a miasma of unwashed bodies, rotting wounds, gun smoke, and the copper tang of fear. It tasted of sulfur and despair. Outside, the Aztec Empire had risen like a sea claiming back the land. They swarmed the walls, a kaleidoscope of feathers, quetzal green, macaw red, heron white, woven into the armor of the eagle and jaguar knights. But to the Spaniards, peering through the arrow slits, they were demons. They did not fear the thunder of the arquebuses anymore. They climbed over the piles of their own dead, scaling the walls with a ferocity that defied human instinct. For every warrior the Spanish steel cut down, 10 more surged forward, driven by a collective soul that demanded the excision of the foreign infection. Juan de Alvarado, his blonde beard matted with sweat, limped towards Cortés. His armor was dented, the steel cuirass bearing the deep scratches of obsidian blades. "The water is gone, Hernán," he croaked, his voice a dry rustle. "The Tlaxcalans are drinking their own urine. The horses are licking the moisture from the stones. If the Mexica do not kill us, the thirst will finish the job by sunrise." Cortés did not look at him. His gaze was fixed on a map spread out on a table, though the map was useless now. The geography of the city had changed. Every canal was a moat, every bridge a choke point, every rooftop a tower of death. "We do not die of thirst, Juan," Cortés said, his voice surprisingly steady, a low rumble beneath the cacophony outside. "We die when I say we die, and I have not given the order." He slammed his fist onto the table, the heavy ring on his finger cracking the wood. "They fight with fury, yes, but they fight without a head. They are a hydra flailing in pain. We must give them their head back, only to cut it off." The Captain General turned, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of the tallow candles that were burning low. "Bring me Moctezuma." The name hung in the air like a curse. The Emperor, the hostage, the puppet. In the early days, his presence had been their shield.
Now, as the hatred of the city boiled over, he was becoming a liability. But Cortés was a gambler, played his chips until the felt of the table was worn through. He would play the emperor one last time. In the deeper recesses of the palace, where the stone dampened the roar of the siege, Moctezuma II sat in darkness.
Cortés met him at the base of the stairs leading to the central balcony. The Spaniard's eyes were hard, desperate. "You will speak to them," Cortés hissed, the interpreter Marina trembling beside him as she translated the harsh Castilian into the flowing Nahuatl. "You will tell them to lay down their arms. You will tell them the Teoles wish only for peace, that we will leave if they open the causeways. Tell them, Moctezuma, or I will let my men carve their way out through the bellies of your wives and children." Moctezuma looked at Cortés, and for a fleeting moment, the old fire of the Tlatoani burned in his dark eyes, a look of infinite pity and contempt. "They will not listen," Moctezuma said softly. "I am no longer their speaker. I am a ghost to them. You have made me a dead man walking." "Speak!" Cortés shoved him towards the light. The balcony overlooked the great plaza. As Moctezuma stepped out, flanked by Spanish soldiers holding bucklers to shield him, a strange phenomenon rippled through the chaotic sea below. The fighting faltered, the screaming abated. A silence, heavy and suffocating, spread outwards from the palace walls like a shockwave. Thousands of faces turned upward. Warriors lowered their obsidian swords. Archers unstrung their bows. For a heartbeat, the divinity of the Tlatoani held sway. He stood there, the green feathers of his headdress catching the wind, the jade ornaments at his ears glinting in the overcast light. He raised his hand, the gesture of a father quieting a room of unruly children. "My people!" his voice cried out, thin and fragile against the wind. "The war must end. These strangers act only because they are afraid. They will leave us. They will return to the waters of the east. Do not shed more blood for—" The spell broke, not with a word, but with a sound, a low growl, starting from the back of the plaza, swelling into a roar of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the sound of a child realizing their father has sold them to the wolves. "Traitor!" The word was screamed by a youth, a jaguar knight, his face painted for death. "Coward! Woman of the Spaniards!" The reverence evaporated, replaced by a fury greater than before. The gods had failed them. Men had to take their place. A stone, jagged and heavy, thrown with the leverage of a sling, whistled through the air. The Spanish guards, mesmerized by the scene or perhaps slow from fatigue, raised their shields a fraction of a second too late. The sound of the impact was sickening, a wet crunch of bone and cartilage. The stone struck Moctezuma on the temple. The emperor's head snapped back with violence. His knees folded. He crumpled, not like a god falling from the heavens, but like a puppet whose strings had been severed. He hit the stone floor of the balcony, a heap of feathers and blood. A gasp rose from the crowd below, a collective intake of breath that sucked the air from the plaza. Then, chaos. The barrage resumed with tenfold intensity. The Spanish dragged the fallen emperor back inside, the shields clattering as a hail of arrows chased them into the shadows. Inside the chamber, they laid him on a straw mattress. He was conscious but silent. His eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling, seeing things no one else could see. Cortés knelt beside him, his face pale. This was not the plan. The shield was broken. "Bandage him," Cortés barked at the surgeon, but Moctezuma raised a hand, weak and trembling, and pushed the bandages away. He refused the water. He refused the prayers. He had been rejected by his people. He would not be kept alive by his captors. He turned his face to the wall, seeking the darkness. The death of the emperor,
Hours or perhaps days later, time was a blur, was a quiet punctuation mark in a paragraph of screaming violence.
The atmosphere inside the palace shifted from desperate defense to the grim realization of the tomb. The walls were closing in. Supplies were non-existent. The powder was damp. The gold they had hoarded, the great stack of bars and ornaments in the treasury room, mocked them. It gleamed in the candlelight, heavy, useless yellow metal that could not buy a drop of water or a breath of air. Cortés called a council of war. It was a gathering of ghosts. His captains, Alvarado, Sandoval, Velázquez de León, sat around the table, their faces gaunt, eyes hollowed by lack of sleep. The candlelight threw long, dancing shadows against the walls, distorting their figures into grotesque shapes. Outside, the rain had begun to fall, a tropical torrent that drummed against the roof, washing the blood from the stones, but not the stench of death from the air. "We cannot stay," Cortés said, his voice devoid of its usual bravado. It was the cold, hard tone of a pragmatist facing the abyss. "The bridges are destroyed, the causeways are broken, but if we stay, we are sacrifices waiting for the knife." He looked at each of them. "We leave tonight. Under the cover of the storm and the darkness, we will build portable bridges for the gaps in the causeway. We will wrap the horses' hooves in cloth to silence them." "And the gold?" asked Narvaez, greed still flickering in his eyes despite the terror. Cortés looked at the pile of treasure in the corner. "Take what you can carry," he said, his lip curling. "But know this, gold is heavy, and the lake is deep. He who travels light travels far. He who burdens himself with the metal will find it a heavy anchor dragging him down to hell." The preparations began in a fevered silence. The claustrophobia was suffocating. Every man knew the odds. They were in the heart of a hostile metropolis, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of warriors who knew every alley, every canal. The palace, once a symbol of their conquest, was now a mouth trying to swallow them whole. Soldiers stuffed their doublets with gold, weighing themselves down, their greed overriding their survival instinct. Others, the veterans, sharpened their swords and tightened their armor, leaving the treasure behind. They knew the currency of the night would be steel and blood, not gold. As midnight approached, the tension stretched to the breaking point. The rain lashed down, a blessing and a curse. It hid their movements, but made the stones treacherous. The fires of the city had burned down to embers, but the presence of the enemy was a physical weight pressing against the gates. Cortés mounted his horse, the beast gaunt and skittish. He looked back one last time at the hall of the Palace of Axayacatl. It was a ruin, a place of filth and misery, but it had been the throne of their ambition. Now they were fleeing it like thieves in the night. "Open the gates," he whispered. The heavy timber groaned, the chains rattled, the gates swung open, revealing the wet, dark maw of the Tacuba causeway. The city awaited, the abyss gazed back. The siege of the Sunstone was over. The night of sorrows had begun.
The air inside the Palace of Axayacatl had become a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from the stench of festering wounds, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke of muskets that had fired until their barrels warped. Outside the thick stone walls, the great city of Tenochtitlan, once a jewel of floating gardens and sparkling canals, had transformed into a rhythmic machine of death. The Tlapanquehuetl, the great war drums of the temple precinct, did not cease. They beat a slow, thundering pulse that vibrated through the floorboards of the Spanish quarters, a heartbeat of the obsidian gods demanding blood. It was the sound of a siege that had turned the hunters into the hunted, enclosing the conquistadors in a gilded cage that was rapidly running out of food, water, and hope. The psychological toll was etched into every face. Eyes were hollow, rimmed with the red irritation of smoke and sleeplessness.
The grandeur of their surroundings, the tapestries and murals of the Aztec emperors now felt like a mockery, a luxurious tomb built for men who had overreached. Hernán Cortés, the architect of this audacious and crumbling enterprise, paced the central courtyard. His face, usually a mask of impenetrable confidence, was drawn tight against the skull, his beard matted with dust and dried sweat. The candlelight caught the hard lines of his jaw as he looked at his captains. They were ragged men now, their finery stained with the gore of 100 skirmishes. The stalemate was breaking, but not in their favor. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma was dead, killed by his own people's rage or a Spanish blade. The truth mattered little now. With him died the last shield protecting the Spaniards from the full, unbridled fury of the Mexica Empire. The bridges were drawn, the causeways were blocked. To stay was to die by starvation, with sacrifice on the stone altars that loomed high above the city. To leave was to run a gauntlet of water and stone against 100,000 warriors who knew every alley and canal of their island home. Cortés stopped pacing. He turned to the map etched into his mind, a mental chart of the trap they occupied. Tenochtitlan was an island, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways. The southern road to Iztapalapa was too long, a march that would expose them for miles. The northern route to Tepeyac was equally exposed and heavily guarded. But to the west lay Tlacopan, the shortest route to the shore, barely 2 miles of stone and water. It was the logical choice, the only choice. But the Mexica, in their tactical brilliance, had removed the wooden bridges that spanned the gaps in the causeway. The road was broken by deep, wide canals. To step onto that road was to step into the void. Cortés's eyes narrowed, the flicker of a desperate idea taking hold. If the bridges were gone, they would bring their own. It was a plan born of pure desperation, a gamble that required the precision of a clockmaker amidst the chaos of a slaughterhouse. Speed and silence would be their only armor. He summoned the carpenters and engineers, men who had swapped their tools for swords weeks ago and whose hands were now calloused from the hilt rather than the handle. "Build me a bridge," Cortés commanded, his voice a low rasp that cut through the murmurs of the wounded and the prayers of the dying. A portable bridge, strong enough to bear the weight of a horse and a cannon, but light enough to be carried by 40 men. It must span the breaches in the causeway. The order was given with the absolute certainty of a man who refused to acknowledge the impossibility of the task. They began immediately, working in the dim recesses of the palace.
"Take what you will," Cortés said, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. He gestured to the pile with a sweep of his hand that seemed almost contemptuous. "It is yours. You have bled for it. But hear me well." He stepped closer, his gaze locking with the frenzied eyes of the front rank. "The night is dark, the rain is coming, and the causeway is broken. We must move like ghosts. We must move like the wind." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, competing with the distant drums. "He travels safest who travels lightest. Do not let this gold be the weight that drags you to the bottom of the lake." It was a warning delivered with the gravity of a funeral rite. It was sound military counsel. It was the logic of survival. But to men who had grown up in the dust of Extremadura, who had gambled their lives on the spin of a coin, the logic of gold was louder. The reaction was visceral. The moment Cortés stepped back, discipline evaporated. The soldiers surged forward. It was a silent riot. There was no cheering, only the heavy breathing of exertion and the metallic clink of gold striking steel. They fell upon the pile like starving wolves upon a carcass. They pushed and shoved, grabbing indiscriminately, the shine of the metal blinding them to the reality of their situation. A young soldier, barely 20, dropped his helmet to scoop up handfuls of golden chains. He wound them around his neck until he looked like a grotesque idol, the metal cold against his sweating skin.
He stuffed bars of gold into the tops of his boots, struggling to stand under the sudden added weight. Nearby, a veteran of the Italian wars, a man who should have known better, was unlacing his cuirass to stuff the cavity against his chest with solid ingots. He grunted as he tightened the straps, his breathing restricted, his mobility compromised, transforming himself into a walking vault. He tested his weight, stumbling slightly, but the allure of the fortune pressed against his ribs silenced his instinct for self-preservation. The men of Narvaez were the worst. They had not seen the ferocity of the Aztec counterattack in the early days. They still believed in their own invincibility. They filled pouches, pockets, and satchels. They tied bundles of loot to their belts until the leather groaned. They were weighing themselves down with stone and metal, ignoring the laws of physics in favor of the laws of greed. The gold clattered against their breastplates, a chorus of doom that drowned out the warnings of the few prudent captains who stood aside, watching with grim resignation. Sandoval and Alvarado exchanged looks of dark foreboding. They saw not wealth, but ballast. They saw men measuring their own coffins. They saw the lake waiting. In the corner of the room, the carpenters finished the bridge. It sat heavy and brooding, a lifeline made of dead wood. Outside, the sky opened up. A drizzle began to fall, turning into a steady, cold rain that slicked the cobblestones and obscured the moon. The gods of Mexico were weeping, or perhaps they were washing the altar clean for the sacrifice to come. The fires in the braziers hissed and dimmed. The shadows lengthened, swallowing the room. The soldiers, now bloated with treasure, waddled and clanked as they formed up, their movements sluggish, their center of gravity shifted. They were no longer an agile fighting force. They were a pack mules laden with death. Cortés mounted his horse, his face grim. He saw the bulging armor, the heavy sacks, the greed-glazed eyes. He knew he could not stop them. To deny them the gold now would be to incite a mutiny before the battle even began. He had given them the choice between wealth and survival, and they had chosen the former.
The air inside the Palace of Axayacatl had turned into a thick, poisonous stew of sweat, rust, and fear. Outside, the heavens had opened up, not with a cleansing storm, but with a miserable, relentless drizzle, a cheepy-cheepy that soaked into the marrow and turned the grand plazas of Tenochtitlan into mirrors of black obsidian. It was the night of sorrows, though they did not call it that yet. Tonight, they only prayed it would be the night of escape. The silence of the men was heavier than the gold they carried. Every soldier knew the stakes. To stay was to die on the altar of Huitzilopochtli, their hearts torn beating from their chests to feed the hungry sun. To leave was to run the gauntlet of the causeways, narrow strips of stone floating on a lake that seemed to have swallowed the world. Hernán Cortés stood near the doorway, his face a mask of shadowed iron. The rain drummed a soft, erratic rhythm against the stone lintels, a whispering countdown. He adjusted his helmet, the metal cold and slick against his cheek. He looked over his men. They were ghosts already, he thought, hollow-eyed, gaunt, their armor muted with mud and soot to stifle the gleam. The horses, those terrifying beasts that had once convinced the Mexica they were gods, were now just nervous animals, their hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the clatter against the paving stones. The smell of wet horsehair mixed with the metallic tang of blood that never seemed to leave their nostrils. This was the end of the dream, or the beginning of the nightmare. The gold, the accursed gold, lay in piles. The king's fifth had been secured, loaded onto the sturdiest horses and the backs of the Tlaxcalan porters. But there was so much left. Heaps of golden ornaments, jade, feathers, and bars of melted wealth lay abandoned on the floor. Take what you will, Cortés had told them, a devil's bargain. But know that wealth is a heavy burden to swim with.
He watched now as soldiers, driven by a greed that overpowered their terror, stuffed their doublets, their greaves, even their helmets with the treasure. They were weighing themselves down with their own watery graves. The Tlaxcalan allies, thousands of them, waited with the patience of stones. They knew this land, they knew the water, and they knew the doom that hung over the city better than any Spaniard. Their eyes were wide in the gloom, reflecting the faint dying embers of the braziers. They did not take the gold, they took their macuahuitls, their obsidian sword clubs, sharpening the edges one last time. They understood that tonight the currency was not gold, but life. The order came not with a shout, but with a hand signal, rippling down the line like a shudder through a dying beast. The vanguard, led by the young and capable Gonzalo de Sandoval, began to move. They carried the bridge. It was a clumsy, heavy thing, built of beams scavenged from the palace ceilings, engineered in desperation. It was their key, their only hope to span the gaps the Aztecs had cut in the causeways. Without it, they were trapped. With it, they might just walk out of the jaws of the beast. The column snaked out of the palace, leaving the safety of the walls for the open, drowning void of the city. The rain was a blessing and a curse. It blinded them, the mist swirling around the temples like the breath of sleeping dragons, obscuring their movement from the sentries on the rooftops. But it also made the stones treacherous. Every step was a gamble, a slip, a clatter of armor, a curse uttered too loud. Any of it could spell death. They moved into the great plaza. It was a cavernous space, alien and terrifying in the dark. To their right loomed the Templo Mayor, a mountain of man-made stone rising into the weeping sky.
The vanguard reached the first breach. The Aztecs had removed the permanent bridges, leaving gaping wounds in the road where the canal water flowed through. This was the test. Sandoval signaled for the portable bridge. 40 Tlaxcalans and 20 Spaniards, groaning under the weight, maneuvered the massive wooden platform forward. The timber creaked, a sound that seemed to scream in the silence. Cortés held his breath. He looked back at the city. It slept. The giant slept. No conch shell sounded. No drums beat. Just the rain. The bridge was lowered. It slammed onto the wet stones with a dull thud that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Silence followed. Painful, stretching silence. Nothing happened. The city remained dark. Sandoval stepped onto the wood. It held. He crossed, his sword drawn, peering into the mist. He waved the others forward. Hope, a fragile and dangerous thing, began to bloom in their chests. Perhaps the Christian God was watching. Perhaps the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl still held enough sway to paralyze the enemy. The column began to flow across the makeshift bridge. Horses balked at the hollow sound of their hooves on the wood, rolling their eyes, nostrils flaring, but the riders spurred them on with desperate whispers. The artillery, the few cannons they had managed to salvage, rumbled heavily, the wheels threatening to slip over the edge into the black water. The gold-laden soldiers stumbled, panting, the weight of their greed dragging at their shoulders. They were halfway across the first gap. The rear guard was still on the island side, the vanguard reaching the solid stone of the causeway beyond. It was working. They were doing the impossible. And then the universe shifted. It was not a soldier who saw them. It was not a warrior. It was a woman. She was a shadow by the water's edge, crouching in the reeds, perhaps fetching water, perhaps checking a fishing net, perhaps simply unable to sleep in the occupation of her city. She looked up. The rain plastered her hair to her skull. In the gloom, she saw the shapes, the monsters, the tales. They were not sleeping in the palace. They were creeping away like thieves in the night. She stood up. She was small, insignificant against the backdrop of the empire and the storm, but her voice carried the weight of a nation's fury. She drew breath,
her chest expanding, her eyes locking onto the metal-clad demons crossing the wooden bridge. The scream tore through the night. It was high, piercing, a shard of glass shattering the heavy, humid air. "Mexicanos!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with terror and rage. "Come out! Come out! The rogues are leaving! They are fleeing!" The Spanish froze. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The rain seemed to hang suspended. The horsemen pulled their reins. The foot soldiers halted mid-step. Every heart in the column hammered against its ribcage like a trapped bird. No, not now, not when we are so close. But the scream was not an isolated event. It was a spark in a room full of gunpowder. High atop the Templo Mayor, a sentry had been watching, suspicious of the shadows. He heard the woman. He saw the movement. He turned to the great drum, the tlapanhuehuetl, a monstrous instrument covered in the skin of giant snakes. He lifted the mallets. Doom! The first beat shook the foundations of the city. Doom! Doom! It was a sound that was felt more than heard, a deep, resonant vibration that rattled teeth and loosened bowels. It was the heartbeat of Tenochtitlan waking up, and it was angry. Immediately, the shell trumpets began to wail, a mournful, terrifying cacophony that echoed from temple to temple, jumping from the center of the city to the shores of the lake, lighting the night with sound.
The rain did not fall, it crushed. It was a weeping curtain of freezing mist and torrential sheets that turned the world into a gray, liquid blur. On the Tacuba causeway, the spine of stone connecting the floating city of Tenochtitlan to the mainland, the silence was heavier than the gold stuffed into the doublets of the Spanish soldiers. It was a suffocating, unnatural quiet, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of steel against steel and the sucking sound of boots pulling free from the mud. The retreat had begun in stealth, a desperate gamble to slip away under the shroud of a storm that the Aztecs, in their superstition, usually avoided. Hernán Cortés, his face a mask of gaunt anxiety beneath his Mauryan helmet, rode near the front, his eyes darting into the impenetrable darkness of the lake that flanked them on both sides. The air smelled of wet wool, rusting iron, and the ozone tang of the storm, but beneath it all lay the copper scent of old blood. The city behind them was a festering wound, and they were the infection trying to drain away. The soldiers moved like ghosts, their breath misting in the cold air, praying to a god that seemed very far away in this heathen land of skull racks and stone idols. They were weighed down, not just by their armor, but by the greed that had been their compass and was now threatening to be their anchor. Pockets, saddlebags, and even helmets were laden with melted bars of gold, the plunder of Moctezuma's treasury. It was the devil's ballast, dragging them toward the earth just when they needed to fly. Every step was a calculation of risk, speed versus wealth, survival versus avarice. The horses, sensing the tension of their riders, stepped gingerly on the wet paving stones, their hooves muffled by rags tied around them, a futile attempt to silence the clatter of the retreat. Then the silence broke. It did not shatter with a scream or a clash of arms, but with a woman's voice, a single cry from the shadows near the canal edge, a water carrier who had seen the glint of foreign steel in the moonlight that briefly pierced the clouds. Her cry was sharp, keening, a needle puncturing the bloated tension of the night. "Mexicanos, come forward! They are leaving! The strangers are fleeing!" The words in Nahuatl were intelligible to most of the Castilians, but the urgency was universal. It rippled through the column like an electric shock. Horses pinned their ears back, men gripped their pike shafts until their knuckles turned white. But the true horror was yet to come. The woman's cry was merely the spark. The explosion came from the heart of the city they were leaving behind. From the summit of the Templo Mayor, the great pyramid that loomed like a jagged mountain of shadow against the storm clouds, a new sound emerged. It began as a vibration in the soles of their feet, a tremor that traveled through the stone of the causeway before it registered in their ears. Boom!
It was a sound so deep, so resonant that it felt less like a noise and more like a physical blow to the chest. It was the huihuetel of the great temple, the sacred war drum carved from the wood of ancient cypresses and covered in the skin of a colossal serpent. Boom! The second beat was louder, echoing off the stone palaces and the surface of the lake, amplifying in the humid air until it seemed to occupy every atom of space. Boom! It was a slow, deliberate, primal heartbeat, the pulse of a sleeping giant suddenly awakened and demanding sustenance. It was the voice of Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the god of war and sun, and he was hungry. To the Tlaxcalan allies marching with the Spanish, that sound was the herald of the apocalypse.
The sky darkened further, not with clouds, but with death. The first volley did not come as individual shots, but as a hailstorm. Arrows, tipped with bone and obsidian, whistled down from the high trajectory of the canoes. Atlatl darts, launched with terrifying velocity, punched through mail and quilted armor alike. Stones slung by expert hands cracked against helmets and shattered teeth. The sound of the impact was a sickening, rhythmic thudding, wet and metallic. Men screamed as barbs found the gaps in their armor, tearing into necks and thighs. A horse reared, an arrow protruding from its eye, throwing its rider into the dark waters below. The splash was instantly followed by the thrashing of water as warriors from the canoes dragged the man under, his heavy armor acting as his coffin. "Santiago! Santiago, and at them!" roared Alvarado from the rear, swinging his sword in a wide arc that severed the arm of a warrior attempting to climb the causeway. But the battle cry rang hollow. There was no "at them." The enemy was everywhere. They were flanked on both sides, trapped on a ribbon of stone only a few paces wide. The Spanish formation, the famous tercio that dominated the battlefields of Europe, was useless here. Pikes could not turn, arquebuses could not be reloaded in the rain and the crush. It devolved instantly into a brawl, a frantic, claustrophobic nightmare of hacking and stabbing. The portable bridge, their lifeline, became their doom. As the vanguard crossed the first gap, the weight of the horses and the artillery jammed the timbers into the soft mud and stones of the causeway. When they tried to lift it to move to the next breach, it would not budge. It was anchored fast by the weight of the retreat. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the army. The realization rippled back through the line. There was no bridge for the second gap, or the third. They were trapped. The order crumbled. It was no longer an army, it was a stampede of terrified animals. The scene was painted in the palette of hell. The deep blacks of the night and the obsidian weapons were slashed with the fiery oranges of the torches and the crimson sprays of arterial blood. The rain hissed as it hit the torches, creating steam that mixed with the fog of war. In the flashes of lightning, one could see the desperation on the faces of the conquistadors, men who had conquered empires, now reduced to sobbing children, scrambling over the bodies of their comrades to escape the inevitable. They slipped on entrails and mud, sliding into the lake where the canoes waited. The water was a cauldron of violence. Aztec warriors leaped from their boats onto the causeway, grappling with the Spanish, trying to drag them alive into the canoes. They sought captives for the stone, not corpses. This terrified the Spanish more than death itself. To be dragged away into the dark, towards the booming drum and the fires of the temple, was a fate worse than the sword. A burly sergeant, his face a mask of blood, fought off 3 jaguar warriors with a broken halberd, screaming blasphemies until a slingstone caved in his temple. He fell into the water, and the gold in his pockets, the heavy ingots of the king's fifth, pulled him straight to the bottom, drowning him in the silt and the riches he had died for. The Tlaxcalan allies fought with the ferocity of those who know no quarter will be given. They grappled with their hereditary enemies in the mud, knives flashing, teeth tearing. It was a civil war played out on a strip of land wide enough for only 4 men abreast.
The crush was so great that men died standing up, suffocated by the pressure of the bodies around them. The gap in the causeway, the one without a bridge, became a pit of horror. It began to fill.
The night did not fall, it collapsed upon them, a suffocating shroud of heavy, wet wool that smelled of stagnant water and ozone. The sky above Tenochtitlan had ceased to be a void of stars and had transformed into a weeping deity, Tlaloc opening the floodgates of the heavens to wash the invaders from the skin of the world. The rain was not merely water, it was a physical assault, cold and relentless, drumming against the steel morions and breastplates of the retreating column with the rhythmic cadence of a death march. Every surface was slick. The stone of the causeway, once a marvel of engineering that floated upon the lake, was now a treacherous ribbon of grease and mud, narrowing into the infinite darkness towards Tlacopan. Cortés had ordered silence, a command that felt absurd in the face of the storm's fury. How could one be silent when the armor clattered, when the horses snorted in nervous agitation, their hooves slipping on the wet masonry? But the greater silence, the one they feared breaking, was the silence of the city behind them, the sleeping giant, the beasts they had wounded but not killed. They moved like phantoms, a column of ghosts laden with the treasures of a shattered empire. The greed that had propelled them across an ocean, through jungles and over mountains, now hung around their necks like a millstone. The king's fifth was loaded onto the strongest horses, but the soldiers, the footmen, the arquebusiers, the crossbowmen, they carried their own burdens. Pockets bulged with gold ingots, helmets were stuffed with jade and turquoise, doublets were lined with bars of melted-down idols. They waddled under the weight of their avarice, their boots sinking deep into the slurry of the road, their breath coming in ragged gasps, not just from exertion, but from the crushing realization that their prize might be their epitaph. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fear, sweating out of every pore, mixing with the rust of their gear. At the vanguard, the wooden bridge, a heavy, cumbersome contraption of timber and desperation, was carried by 40 Tlaxcalan allies and the chosen engineers. It was the key to their salvation. The Aztecs had removed the permanent bridges to trap the Spaniards in the heart of the city, leaving gaping wounds on the causeway where the dark waters of the lake flowed freely. This portable span was their only answer, a fragile link between the island of death and the mainland of survival. They reached the first gap. The water below churned, black as ink, whispering against the stone foundations. The bridge was lowered. It groaned, the wood settling into the mud and the rough-hewn stone lips of the canal. It held. Sandoval, leading the vanguard, crossed first. His horse's hooves hollow-thudded on the timber. He held his breath, expecting the wood to splinter, but it held. Behind him, the column pressed forward. The friction of hundreds of feet, the iron-shod hooves of terrified destriers, the wheels of the few remaining culverins, all of it ground the bridge down. The rain intensified, blinding them. Lightning cracked the sky open, a jagged scar of violet light that momentarily illuminated the world in a strobe of horror. In that flash, they saw the lake. It was not empty. The surface of the water, which should have been a flat mirror of the storm, was boiling. Ripples, waves not caused by the wind. And then the sound changed. The drumming of the rain was joined by a new rhythm, a low, thrumming beat that vibrated in the teeth of every man on the causeway. Drums, the great skin-skein drum of the temple pyramid behind them began to throb, a heartbeat of doom that echoed across the valley. Then came the whistle, a piercing shriek-like sound that cut through the thunder. Tlacopan.
And then there was the gold. Juan de Velázquez had been a poor man when he left Cuba. He had been a poor man when they marched into Tenochtitlan. Now he was rich.
He carried enough gold in his breeches and his doublet to buy a castle in Castile. He felt the weight of it, a comforting solidity against his ribs. It was his future. He would not abandon it. When the press of the crowd shoved him, he stumbled. His boots slid on the entrails of a disemboweled horse. He flailed, grabbing at the cloak of the man in front of him, but the fabric tore. Juan went over the edge. For a moment he was suspended in the air, a grotesque bird of steel and greed. He hit the water with a massive splash. He expected to swim. He knew how to swim, but he had forgotten the physics of his avarice. The armor was heavy, yes, the steel breastplate, the mail, the helmet, but it was the gold that killed him. The heavy bars, dense and unforgiving, acted as an anchor. He kicked, thrashing against the black fluid, his mouth opening to scream, only to be filled with the foul taste of the lake. He sank like a stone dropped down a well, down into the cold. The sounds of the battle above, the screams, the clash of steel, the thunder, became muffled, distant, surreal. He clawed at the water, clawing at the gold in his pockets, trying to rip it free, to shed the weight. But the wet fabric held fast. The gold was part of him now. His lungs burned. His vision sparked with lights that weren't there. The last thing Juan de Velázquez felt was not the glory of conquest, but the crushing, heavy embrace of the treasure he had died for. He settled into the silt at the bottom of the lake, a golden statue in a tomb of mud, while the war raged above his head. On the surface, the scene was apocalyptic. The gap in the causeway, the second canal, was deep and wide. The Spaniards, driven by the madness of terror, began to try and swim it. But the Aztecs were waiting. Long pikes jabbed from the canoes, hooking men like fish. They didn't want to kill them all. They wanted captives. They wanted hearts for Huitzilopochtli. A horse, its hamstring severed by an obsidian blade, screamed, a sound more horrifying than any human cry. It thrashed in the mud, crushing the legs of a soldier beneath it. The soldier beat his fists against the animal's flank, weeping, until a stone from the darkness ended his misery. The water in the gap began to fill. It filled not with earth or timber, but with the debris of the rout, boxes of ammunition, bales of cloth, idols, and bodies. First the horses, then the Tlaxcalan allies dying in droves to protect the retreat, then the Spaniards. Men were pushed into the gap by the crush behind them. They flailed and drowned, and the men behind them stepped on their faces to cross. It became a bridge of flesh. Pedro de Alvarado, the sun-haired captain, found himself at the edge. The bridge of corpses was not yet high enough. He looked back. The rearguard was gone, swallowed by the night and the warriors of the eagle and jaguar. He looked forward. The gap was 10 feet wide. He planted his long lance into the wreckage at the bottom of the canal, the body of a horse perhaps, or a pile of luggage. He vaulted. For a second he flew, a golden figure against the lightning-streaked sky. He landed on the other side, stumbling, gasping, mud-splattered but alive. He turned to look back. The causeway was a vision of hell painted by a madman. The fires from the distant temples cast a hellish, flickering glow on the rain, illuminated the glint of wet steel, the white of terror-widened eyes, and the red spray of arterial blood mixing with the rain. The Aztec warriors were everywhere. They were pulling men from their saddles. The air was not air. It was a slurry of mist, smoke, iron, and the copper tang of pulverized humanity. It clotted in the throat, burning the lungs with every jagged intake of breath. Silence had not yet fallen, but the deafening rhythmic cacophony of the war drums, the huehuatl that had pounded like the heartbeat of a dying god throughout the night, had finally receded into a dull, throbbing echo within the skull.
They were on the mainland. The ground beneath their boots was no longer the treacherous, shifting masonry of the causeway, nor the horrifying softness of submerged corpses that had served as bridges over the gaps in the dikes. It was the solid, muddy earth of Popocla and Tacuba. But there was no triumph in this solidity. There was only the crushing gravity of survival. Hernán Cortés stumbled. The man who had maneuvered empires, who had charmed kings and dismantled civilizations with a smile and a sword, was reduced to a stumbling scarecrow of dented steel and matted gore. His left hand throbbed with a sickening rhythm, 2 fingers severed, the wound hastily bound in a rag that was already soaked through with blackening blood. A wound to the head had left his vision swimming, the world tilting on a violently unstable axis. He did not walk so much as fall forward, catching himself with the hilt of his sword, then dragging his leaden feet for another yard. Around him, the remnants of the expedition emerged from the gray shroud of the lifting mist like ghouls rising from a mass grave. They were unrecognizable as the splendid conquistadors who had entered Tenochtitlan months prior. Their armor, once polished to a mirror sheen that dazzled the natives, was now battered, hacked, and coated in a thick paste of mud and dried viscera. Plumes were shorn off helmets, chainmail was ripped open to reveal gashes of weeping flesh, and eyes, God, their eyes, stared out from masks of grime with the hollow 1,000-yard gaze of men who had looked into the abyss and seen it blink back. The rain had stopped, replaced by a clammy, clinging dampness that chilled the sweat on their skin, sending shivers through bodies already pushed beyond the limits of biological endurance. The dawn was breaking. It was not a glorious sunrise. It was a pale, sickly gray light that seemed to ooze over the horizon, reluctant to illuminate the atrocities of the night. It filtered through the canopy of the trees, casting long, twisting shadows that looked like grasping Aztec fingers. Cortés stopped. His breath came in ragged hitches, a sound like tearing parchment. He looked around, trying to take stock, trying to find the commander within the wreckage of the man. He saw shapes collapsing into the mud. Men didn't sit, they simply ceased to stand, their strings cut, dropping into the filth and curling into fetal balls, too exhausted to weep, too broken to speak. He saw a horse, one of the few remaining, its flank deeply scored by an obsidian maquairu whittle. Standing with its head low, trembling violently, foam dripping from its muzzle mixed with blood. It was a tableau of absolute ruin. The silence of the morning was punctuated only by the wet coughing of the wounded and the distant fading screams from the causeway behind them, the sounds of the stragglers being dragged off to the sacrificial stones. Cortés turned. He did not want to look. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep moving, to put the lake behind him, to run until his heart burst. But he was the Captain General. He had to look. He turned his body, fighting the stiffness of his armor and the agony in his limbs, and looked back toward the great city of Tenochtitlan.
The news hit Cortés like a physical blow. The rear guard was gone. Hundreds of Spaniards, thousands of Tlaxcalans, the artillery, the gunpowder, the horses, the records, the loot, everything. The magnitude of the failure was absolute. This was not a retreat, it was an amputation. They had left the better half of themselves rotting on that causeway. The Tlaxcalan survivors, those few who had made it, sat in silent circles, their grief profound and internalized. They had lost not just warriors, but princes and leaders. Their alliance with these metal-clad strangers had cost them a generation of blood. Cortés turned away from Alvarado, unable to bear the accusation in his lieutenant's eyes, unable to bear the sight of the carnage any longer. He needed to be alone.
He needed to hide. He stumbled away from the gathered survivors, moving toward a grove of trees that stood slightly apart from the road to Tacuba. There, dominating the landscape, stood a massive Ahuehuete tree. It was an ancient giant, its trunk gnarled and twisted by centuries of growth, its roots delving deep into the earth like the veins of the land itself. Its branches spread wide, a canopy of weeping cypress leaves that offered a dark, secluded shelter. The tree seemed to possess a solemn gravity, a silent witness to the passage of empires. Cortés approached the tree as a sinner approaches a confessional. He reached out with his trembling hand and touched the rough, fissured bark. It was cold and damp, real and solid in a world that had dissolved into madness. The strength left his legs. He slid down the trunk, the metal of his backplate scraping against the wood until he hit the earth. He sat there, his legs sprawled out in front of him, his head falling back against the tree. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the fighting, through the desperate swim across the gaps, through the terror of the night, finally evaporated. In its void, a crushing weight descended. He closed his eyes, and the images came rushing back. The scream of the horses as they were hamstringed, the sound of obsidian blades crunching through bone, the desperate pleas of his men as they were dragged into the canoes, screaming, "Help me! For the love of God, help me!" as they were hauled away to the sacrificial altars of Huitzilopochtli. He saw the faces of the men he had recruited in Cuba, the men he had promised gold and glory. He had led them to the slaughterhouse. The realization of his own hubris choked him. He had thought himself chosen by God, invincible, a new Caesar. He had played a game of chess with an emperor, Moctezuma, and thought he had won. But the board had been overturned, and the pieces were broken. He was not a conqueror now. He was a fugitive, a failure. A sob ripped through his chest, painful and jagged. It was followed by another, and then another, until his whole body was shaking with the violence of his grief. Hernán Cortés, the man of iron, the scourge of the Aztecs, buried his face in his hands and wept. He wept with the raw, ugly abandon of a child. Tears cut tracks through the soot and blood on his face, dripping onto his rusted armor. He wept for the friends he would never see again. He wept for the horses, those noble beasts who had trusted him. He wept for the gold that now lay at the bottom of the lake, the useless metal that had cost so many souls. He wept for the Tlaxcalans. But mostly, he wept for the shattering of his own ego, the destruction of his dream. The wind rustled the leaves of the Ahuehuete above him, a sound like 1,000 whispering voices. Was it the wind, or was it the spirits of the dead gathering to accuse him? The tree, this silent sentinel, absorbed his grief, standing unmoving as the man beneath it broke into pieces.